Nathan Knight never wanted to be a pastor, and certainly not a church planter. But as he often does, the Lord gradually opened Nathan's heart to the work of pastoral ministry and church planting, helping him see that such work was not less than other callings, but is instead crucial and important for the building up of Christ's kingdom. But as Nathan got further and further into the work of church planting, he began to notice some problems with what he calls the church planting industry. Rather than pursuing a truly biblical vision of planting healthy churches, many planters focus more on metrics drawn from the business world. Metrics like size, speed, self-sufficiency, and spread. And while paying attention to these metrics isn't necessarily wrong, placing too much of an emphasis on them can start to deform a church, distracting pastors from the core of their calling, shepherding the people God has entrusted to them. Today, I'm talking with Nathan about his journey to pastoral ministry, why he's concerned about the way that church planting is often done today, and what he sees as a better way based on the New Testament. Nathan is a pastor at Restoration Church in Washington, D.C., and serves on the lead team for the Treasuring Christ Together Church Planting Network. He's also the author of Planting by Pastoring, a vision for starting a healthy church from Crossway. Let's get started. Well, Nathan, thank you so much for joining me today on the Crossway podcast.
Thanks. Good to be here.
So today we're going to talk about church planting and some of the unique challenges and even temptations or maybe wrong ways of thinking that can sometimes slip in as we think about church planting. But before we get into some of that, could you just share a little bit about your own experience as a pastor and church planter?
Yeah, I was resistant to the ministry of pastoring for a while. My wife wanted to marry a pastor. I told her it's not going to happen. And the Lord, in his infinite kindness, I guess, brought me along that path. I was in sales for 5 years and came out of that, went to seminary, and was just enthralled with the image that the Bible has of the church. And then that then led me in early and through seminary an interest in the church and pastoral ministry. And it was through just some wisdom from the elders of my church, along with just some good friends and prayer, that led me down the path to pastoring through church planting versus revitalizing, mainly because I think I wasn't very patient back in those days, and I guess maybe still am not, but the Lord led me into pastoring through an interest in the church and planting through just a temperament, I think. But yeah, as we talk about in the book, I think every planter should be a pastor.
So you mentioned that you were resistant to the idea of pastoral ministry for a while. What do you think was behind that?
I remember saying, it's funny to say now, but I remember saying to my wife, the Lord needs people in the trenches, as if pastoral ministry is not in the trenches. But I thought that I was sort of more, that obviously business people are, but I didn't see pastoral ministry as in the trenches, which is ridiculous to think now, but that was why.
So it wasn't like this resistance to the idea of doing ministry and giving the Lord your life. It was almost like you just thought the best way to do that was in secular work, so to speak.
That's exactly right. And I thought the pastors are back there sort of in the safe area as if they weren't doing any work. It was a bad understanding of pastoral ministry.
Yeah, this is a little bit tangential to the main focus that I want to talk with you about, but I wonder if we can just press in. What do you think it was about your experience with pastoral ministry or with the church that kind of led you to have that impression before you actually started getting into seminary?
Yeah, I think it is related to the book in a conversant kind of way, but the conversal kind of way that I understood that pastors were sort of back there, going to retirement homes and, putting sermons together, but they weren't really out there doing the work. I didn't understand that going to the retirement home and preaching sermons and praying for people and weeping with those that weep, I didn't see that as the work. And I was wrong to do that. Whereas I saw the work really was being out there where the lost people were. And by the way, that's another thing I failed to understand, is that pastors are where lost people are. And so I think there was this delineation that saw the faithful work of a pastor as being tame and not hard and risky and pushing and the like, and the work of the businessman as the opposite of that. And I was wrong.
Yeah. Okay, so you enroll in seminary, you get through seminary, you get a job at a church, and then it's through that experience that you first start to think about the possibility of church planting. As you look back at that time before you actually committed to that path and started to pursue that, what are some of the maybe misconceptions that you had about what it meant to be a church planter? I wonder even if you expand that, are there other misconceptions that you often encounter with people, whether they're pastors, seminary students, or even just lay people in your church that
Yeah.
about church planting?
Yeah. Well, first, I would have understood myself. I think, like a lot of people I even interact with today, I would have thought that the Bible doesn't really have much to say about the church. It doesn't really give much definition. It doesn't give a really church membership and church discipline. I never heard of those things before I got to seminary. And so the more I started to read the Bible, the more I started to see these things were actually in the Bible, that church membership was in the Bible, that the importance of particular people being pastors and others not being pastors was in the Bible, and church discipline is in the Bible. And right, all these different things were actually there. I just didn't see them and wasn't led to see them. And then the more that I saw them, the more I became interested in them, not as a church planter that I had experienced was more from an entrepreneurial mindset. Namely, it was not really doing all of that work of putting ecclesiology in its place, but it's more just getting out there and trying to gather people as quickly as possible. And so the more I saw that the Bible taught ecclesiology, it was there. And secondly, that the image of a church planter as entrepreneur didn't really match that, I began to be more intrigued to lean in and try to think about it a little bit more carefully. And that's when I got interested in church planting.
Hmm. So interesting. And we're going to get into some of the dominant ways that we often think and certainly talk about church planting in our culture today. That's really the core of what your book is about. But even before we go there, I know one question that I've heard expressed, and I probably even wondered this at times related to church planting, especially in the U.S., is a big question. Does the U.S. really need more churches? Why not focus on church planting around the world in places where there aren't already lots of churches within virtually every city? And obviously, a lot of people are church planting around the world. But how would you respond to a question like, do we really need more churches in the U.S.?
Yeah. I think on the one hand, I would say, yeah, maybe we don't in certain places. I remember being in a certain city not long ago at Christmas time, just driving around, seeing so many churches and forgetting, my goodness, I used to live there and I didn't realize there were so many churches. So yeah, I can understand the question. I think what I would say in response is that we don't necessarily need more churches in the U.S., more so than we need more healthy churches in the U.S. So there's a big difference in those two things. And the more that we understand a robust biblical ecclesiology, what the Bible teaches about the church, who should lead it, what is it doing, and we don't see those kinds of things more carefully practiced, I find that kind of stuff is not as common. And so we need more churches like that. If all of those churches I was driving by in that city were doing all of that stuff, maybe we wouldn't need as many as we're saying. But what I find is that it's not as common to find churches that are trying to do the kinds of things that the Bible is calling us to. And so therefore, we do need more churches as a result.
So would that be part of what you would talk to a potential church planter about? You'd want to really carefully assess wherever city we're thinking about going into or area, are there other really good, solid churches that are healthy? And if so, that might lead you to say, let's not try to plant a church there.
That's exactly right, Matt. Yeah. So one of the things that I have in the book, we talk about choosing a place. And living here in Washington, D.C., I'll occasionally have church planters come to me, and they will have already decided that Washington, D.C. is the city that they're going to plant in. But they're coming to me to talk about where the gaps are, and they'll give me a few ideas. And I'll tell them, well, brother, there's already a healthy church right there. And well, what about this other community? Well, there's another healthy church there. And so I think what we can do is when choosing place is we might have this understanding that the city is just this lost place that needs tons of good churches, but we actually haven't done the homework to see that maybe there's not a Southern Baptist church, but maybe there's a healthy PCA church or a healthy Anglican church there that they just didn't know about. And so carefully choosing cities and locations inside of those cities where healthy church are is critical. And the way that we do that, I think, is by talking to the healthy planters, healthy pastors that are already on the ground. And the more that we can have those discussions before we choose place, I think the better we can start to plant churches that are more spread out in meeting needs where they're needed the most.
It doesn't seem uncommon in my experience to hear church planters or people who are aspiring to be a church planter often they seem to have a place that they've identified, and they'll use language like, I just feel like God is leading me to Des Moines, Iowa, and I feel like I really need to be there. Not
Right.
that many people find they want to go
Yeah.
to Iowa, but I'm
Right.
from Iowa, so I can say that. But
Build it and they will come.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. But I think so. What do you make of that? Is that it doesn't seem to always fit, perhaps, with what you just said about doing some research and thinking carefully about, is there truly a need in this area?
Yeah, so important. I think there's, in some planting circles, there is a heavy emphasis on what we call calling. Matter of fact, when you're going through an assessment, that's one of the first questions and most important questions they think to ask is, tell me your calling. And by calling, what they mean is this more subjective understanding from the Lord about where the Lord wants them to go. And I'm just a little cautious about emphasizing that thing because our subjective understandings of our quote unquote calling is just not very reliable. And so that doesn't mean it's unimportant. That doesn't mean we shouldn't evaluate it. But I don't think it's as important because if the Lord seems to be calling me to a community where there's 2 or 3 healthy churches already exist, and there's this other community across the tracks or across the country that's have more need, I'm just going, well, brother, it may be the Lord is calling you there, but man, why not? Look at, there's more need over here. And so I would want to underemphasize, not get rid of, underemphasize a subjective understanding of calling and raise up the kind of thing that we see Paul doing when he says in Romans 15 that he understands his ministry to have been filled in this area and he wants to go to another area. Let's have more of an interest in trying to put healthy churches where there's a need and emphasizing that more so than subjective callings.
That's really helpful. Maybe one other big picture question related to the planting that came to my mind as I thought about this. It seems like there was a time, maybe we're getting past that time a little bit, but there was a time when it seemed like the predominant emphasis when it came to church planting was the strategic goal of reaching the city. Cities kind of had this overarching dominant emphasis in the culture of church planting, the language, the conversation. What do you make of that? Is that still the case? Do you agree with that? And how do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't hear that language as much. It's funny, sometimes you can figure out when a church was planted based off of its name. There was a time, like if it was a Greek word of the church, it was probably planted about 20 years ago. And more recently, if there's a city in the name, it was probably planted about 7 or 8 years ago. And so
There's church planting fads, huh? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, of course there are. Yeah, I'm sure I've participated in some of them, but it's not all bad. So yeah, I do hear some of that emphasis on city, a little bit more recently, but I do think it's still there, and I think it's good that it's there, right? I'm trying to think about the city, but I think one thing that we've learned over the course of time, as we've emphasized that notion of city for 10 or 15 years, we're finding that you can do really good work and find that if you were to leave the community, they wouldn't know or care. And that's sort of the language that we sometimes use. We want to be the kind of church that where we serve there so well that this community, the city would be sad to see us go. Well, I'm pretty sure that Corinth and Thessalonica and Lystra would be more than happy to see those churches gone away because they're stoning people and hating those people, and yet they're doing really good work. So I think the metric of reaching the city and having the city love us as we love them, those are, again, kind of frail places to point at to say that we're doing our work well, when, again, let's just go back to the Bible, let those be the metrics. And then I think we'll find the city may not really care that we're doing much there. They might not even like us, but in the eyes of God, it's doing well.
It seems like that whole city emphasis, to me, it's often paired with, maybe more so than churches in the suburbs or in the country, it's often paired with the idea of the influential church, the
That's
church
good.
that is well known, and they're sort
Right.
of touching maybe the highest reaches of power and influence in a place. Is that part of maybe what has been behind an emphasis on the city?
Yeah, it's a good point, Matt. I do think you find that this is the good influence of Tim Keller, right? And his book, Center Church, and all that you saw there. And one of the things again, going back to these people that come to me, they just assume that Washington, D.C. has all this need. And we find out that actually there's 3 or 4 places that they kind of want to plant, and there's actually healthy churches there. And then I'll say, well, what about what's going on in this bedroom community outside of DC, and that city notion is not nearly as attractive. What's going on in Germantown? What's going on in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia? That's not the city as such as you're referencing, and yet those are people that need Jesus. Man, they need Jesus. They need a healthy church. Whereas right here in a part of the city, as you said, there's actually a lot of good churches, or at least a sufficient churches, where they're not in Harpers Ferry and in Germantown or some other bedroom community. And man, those people are important too. So yeah, maybe that city influence could have us to lose sight of some other communities that are just as important.
Yeah. And obviously, there's no clear direction on any of this from God. These are
That's
judgment calls. These are different people are going to have different convictions about things. But it's just important to maybe call out some of the dominant ways of thinking that I think can often characterize. And that kind of leads then to one of the main focuses of your book, which is thinking about the ways that you use the word entrepreneurial. This kind of a certain kind of spirit often characterizes a church planting effort. And in the book, you talk about the 4 S's of church planting. I wonder if you could just summarize, what are those 4 S's and what do they reveal about how we often think about church planting today?
Yeah, this book, Planting by Pastoring, is trying to be a little bit of a corrective, not a rejection, just a little bit of a corrective, more of an emphasis in the place that Jesus seems to be emphasizing. And so we've been talking for the last 10 minutes or so about place and how we choose place and what that place ought to be. So in similar ways, getting even into the heart of church planting, the 4 S's would seem to indicate the kind of success, quote unquote, that the church planting industry would ascribe to planters. And those 4 S's are size, speed, self-sufficiency, and spread. And so size, big, and that big doesn't have to be thousands. It could just be 100 or 200. Size, speed, get it quickly, and then self-sufficiency, financial self-sufficiency, be able to support yourself, and then spread, multiply. I'd throw a 5th one in there even and say span, right? The amount of time. So get size, get it quickly, be self-sufficient, multiply your church, and do that over a long period of time, and you have achieved church planting success. Again, I want all those things. I trust, Matt, you want those things. And listener, I trust you want those things. I want those things. We've been working at those things, but they're not the center, right? In the same way that if I were to say to my wife when we got engaged, like, listen, success for us is having as many kids as we can have, right? My wife would be a little concerned for good reason, right? And so therefore, what I want to do is say that those 4 things are good, but I want to actually put a couple things more at the center in evaluating church planting success. And those 2 things can be found at the end of John 21 when Jesus is meeting with his lead church planter, Peter, right? Those 2 things, he asked Peter, Jesus is speaking to his lead planter, as it were. He's getting ready to leave. Peter is about to be commissioned out after his church planting residency of 3 years to go start the first church. And he asks him 2 things. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And then Peter says, yes, you know I do. And Jesus' response is, tend my sheep, feed my lambs. And those 2 things, what Jesus seems to be emphasizing before he goes, is love for Christ as the motive, as the driver, as the reason, as the aim, treasuring Christ together. And secondly, for whoever it is that responds, you tend to those sheep. You care for them. You feed them, which the church planting industry they're going to value those things, but they're going to not stress those because they're concerned it's going to slow them down. So that might get into another line of questioning. But again, summarizing, 4 S's, good stuff. We love that stuff. But I think it's important that Scripture is emphasizing. We need to emphasize in ways I don't see us emphasizing a lot. This treasuring of Christ as the driver. And then secondly, for those that respond, tending to pastoring, not entrepreneurs, pastors that are caring for the sheep that Jesus purchased with his own blood.
So as you contrasted this emphasis, this biblical emphasis on the pastoring work, like you just said, to the quote-unquote church planting industry. You mentioned that a couple times.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? Where is that? Where do we see that? Because I would imagine, talk to any church planter and ask them, how important is your love for Christ and your love for your people? And they're going to say, those are foundational. Those are central. So where do we see the church planting industry, so to speak, rearing its head?
I assume that these guys that I speak to and that they do love Jesus and they do want to care for Jesus' sheep at some level. So again, it's sort of a matter of emphasis. You are what you emphasize. And so therefore, we want to bring the emphasis more clearly back into the center. And so I've seen things on social media that say the goal of church planting is multiplication. I think that's that's not bad, right? We want multiplication, but I don't think that's a helpful way to talk about church planting, because the church planting industry is going back to that notion of entrepreneurial, right? The business world, which we use a lot of those terms in the church planting world, right? Preview services and launching, right? Which is more ascribed to the business world. When we use those metrics, the business world is measuring their success on size and speed and profit and the like. And Jesus is measuring things not on those things. He's looking at the small and the weak, right? Jesus most definitely succeeded, and he's got 120 people sitting scared in a room after he is crucified. And so, therefore, bringing more of an emphasis of biblical terms and biblical ideologies, and not getting rid of, but just de-emphasizing the more profit-centered notions, numerical success. I think what that's going to do is it's actually going to make us more healthy. I talk about in the book, the three little pigs, right? The business world, those metrics are more like strict sticks and straw, but the big bad wolf, man, he's coming. And we need to build churches that are made of bricks, which is more of that treasuring Christ as the center and pastoring the people that respond. And I believe those things will stand up, not so much the church planting sort of industry or the entrepreneurial notions, because those things are more flimsy and harder for us to actually define as success.
So you've spoken a little bit about the priorities of the church planter and maybe the way that the church, the leadership of the church views the church coming from this entrepreneurial mindset. Speak a little bit to even the character qualities and the personality types of the church planter himself. I think sometimes in my experience, again, you hear certain statements made about the kind of guy who is going to be successful as a church planter, needing to have himself an entrepreneurial, a go get 'em, a don't take no for an answer kind of attitude or mentality. Is that part of what you're pushing back against as well?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, I can remember going through, and even today, you talk to a guy and maybe he's more quiet, more reserved. He doesn't have a track record of starting things from nothing and growing them. And they would look at them and say, while you might be a good pastor, you're not a good church planter. And what's going on in the back of their minds, I think, is, even I'm guilty of this too, that in the back of their mind, it's those 4 S's, right? They're not going to be able to accomplish those 4 S's of size, speed, self-sufficiency. They're not charismatic, right? They're not going to garner a crowd. They're a little bit more quiet and reserved. And so what I want to say is, I do think there needs to be, a church planter needs to have a little bit of grit to him, right? Need to go. It's even using the language and the understanding of entrepreneurialness. It's not bad or wrong in and of itself. But I think what we need to do better is understand that guy. Maybe he's not very charismatic and loud and going to garner a whole bunch of people and have all that grit that we would like. But when we center more biblical ecclesiology with the goal of treasuring Christ, maybe he won't have a big church. Maybe it'll only be 10 or 15 or 20 people. But does that mean he failed? Does that mean that he can't be a pastor? Does it mean that he can't plant a church? Right? So I think, again, that notion, what's going on is those 4 S's, and we need to be more careful to say that, brother, maybe you're not going to be a pastor of 200 people or 500 people in planting this church. Maybe it's only going to be 20 or 30. Based upon just sort of, Lord, how the Lord built you and the way the world works and these kinds of things. But that doesn't mean that he can't plant. We just have to know, we have to have those expectations going in. It appears as though, common grace, that it might not be big, but that doesn't mean he shouldn't do it.
Yeah, what I hear you saying too is that not every church plant is going to necessarily look the same, and there's going to be different personalities, and that's actually okay. There's not one
good
personality type. Yeah, even good. So there, at one point in your book, you had this really, really powerful line that I just really was impressed with. You say, when we aim so much at reaching more people, it becomes easy to look past the ones that we already have. And I thought that was such an insightful comment. And it's a danger that, as I thought more about this, we're all familiar with this danger. We all fall into this trap of so easily taking for granted those who are closest to us, even neglecting those who are closest to us, for the sake of maybe the as of yet found people out there or someone who's further away from us. Unpack that a bit more, that tendency as it applies to church planting.
Yeah, you look at the beginning and end of Paul's epistles, 2 local churches that he planted, and you'll notice he's regularly using names, right? So the emphasis on the Lord, even we think about in the book of Revelation, right? There's the book of life, and our names, our individual names are written there. Jesus knows us by name. And so therefore, names ought to be our motive, not numbers as such. And so, in fact, I think what we can do is we so overlook people. We get somebody to pray a prayer and we baptize them and we celebrate them, and we should. Praise the Lord. But then we sort of move on. And what I find, if you actually slow down and think about it, just think about the New Testament, right? Jesus says that there's 4 kinds of people, right? The people that hear the gospel and reject it. And then the other side, right? They hear and bear fruit 30, 60, 100-fold. But there's 2 kinds of people that claim to have received Jesus, but the cares of the world or suffering chokes it out. Jesus even references in Matthew 7 that there's going to be these people that claim to know him, but Jesus never knew them. And then you go and look in the New Testament and find Paul is writing all these letters to churches that he planted, and there's all this doctrinal distortion and this misunderstanding. He writes to the pastoral epistles and tells them to be warned that there are people that are going to profess to know God, but they don't. There's going to be people that are going to want to accumulate teachers, right, that actually are not teaching the gospel. The book of Galatians is a group of churches that have distorted the gospel. And we look at the end of the book of Revelation, and what do we find? The 7 churches, most of them are not doing good. Ephesus lost their first love. So I think we need to be more careful with the way we use this word reach. We reached 500 people last year, when in fact, we need to be careful to evaluate those 4 soils. And the more that we pay attention to names, to the people right in front of us, slow down, to walk them through the sufferings, the difficulties, and the fleshliness of this world, to try to shepherd them on till they get home to heaven. That's the work. Instead of just sort of getting people baptized and putting in the church and moving on, we need to be more careful. And the more we do that, the stronger the church gets and the more Christ is glorified.
It seems like another way to talk about maybe part of the core of what you're getting at is just we need churches that emphasize discipleship, ongoing
Amen.
discipleship, more than just evangelism or even just growth or new members. Is that getting at the core of what you're saying?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so we get right. I'm sure you've heard the phrase before, Matt, this notion of Jesus doesn't say, he says, go make disciples, not make converts, right? That's the idea. Teaching them to obey all that I have commanded you. I've heard 1,000 evangelistic sermons from that passage, and rarely do we get to that second half of discipleship, right? Teaching them to obey. And apparently, giving that thrust of what we just gave, that's going to be really hard for people taking the name of Jesus, much less those that are obviously apart from Jesus. They can't do it apart from his saving work. But yeah, it's the work of discipleship, and discipleship and pastor and even friend that's listening to this, right, is really hard work.
Yeah, it's inefficient work. You can't do it fully in a big group context where you're just, preaching a message to 100 people. It's really eventually boils down to one-on-one or one-on-two kinds of conversations.
Yes, that's right. So that's why things like membership and pastoral oversight is so important, because it's so hard and discipleship is slow and it's difficult. We had a church planter here in the city. We have a monthly group where church planters meet here once a month just to help each other, encourage each other. And years ago, a larger church that was his biggest financial contributor, they dropped him as a financial contributor when they found out he was doing membership interviews and membership discussions, because they thought that it was unhelpful to the spread of the gospel. I see it the exact opposite way, that the more that we see people, love people, walk with people, warn people, love people through the goods and the bads, the stronger the church gets, the better the evangelistic witness as we walk with people, not only evangelistically, but discipling them from the moment they're born again to the day that they die.
Yeah, hence the title of your book, Planting by Pastoring, by Shepherding. Yeah, that's so good. So then maybe as a final question, help us think through the balance, though, between what you're talking about, this emphasis on day-to-day pastoring and shepherding, on faithfulness to the gospel and reliance on Christ for growth and fruitfulness. How do you do those things without neglecting to think strategically about things like growing my membership and our finances as a church and engaging visitors well so that they maybe want to come back, and all of those things that can sometimes feel like maybe they're a little more tactics versus the core of pastoral ministry. How do you keep those things in balance?
Yeah, such an important question. Yeah, so when you look at the great church planter named Paul, and you look at how he talked and what he talked about, he said things like this in Philippians 3, which you know, right? I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. In other words, he was so enthralled with the glory of Christ and knowing Christ that it then had him to spend himself for the churches and those outside of those churches that he wanted to come in. So Matt, to answer your question, I think the more of an interest we have in knowing and enjoying Christ, treasuring Christ together, the more that we will do the work to make sure and care for the sheep and not lose sight of strategically advancing that gospel. So in other words, I really do believe the more of an interest we have, not in strategy, not in just making our church bigger and multiplying our church more. No, the more that we have an interest in seeing and savoring Christ, the more that we will do all that we need to do. That seemed to be the case for Peter and for Paul that are planning most of these churches. Take more of an interest in Christ and you will not neglect anything.
How common is the opposite danger? Maybe the danger of the pastor or church that is just, maybe a way to talk about it would be like over-spiritualized in how they think about their role in a place, where they're just they don't do any kind of strategic outreach. We're just going to be the healthiest church we can be in terms of how we operate internally, but we don't need to think too much about how we're going to effectively reach out to others.
Yeah, I would say to them that they have a truncated view of their love for Jesus. They have not, right? Like you've heard this example, right? I get a great gift. I want to tell everybody about it, right? I love my wife. I have the most beautiful, most amazing wife on planet Earth. Give me just an instant and I'm going to tell you all about her, right? So in the same way that if you truly treasure Christ like you say you do, then you will not be satisfied with mere church health. You'll want to spread that news to more and more people that your Jesus that you love will be lifted up and more increasingly treasured amongst communities, church communities around your city and around the globe. So to treasure Christ is to be strategic and to spread. If you don't understand that, then I'm wondering if you're really treasuring Jesus.
Well, Nathan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today and help maybe sharpen a little bit in all of our minds the role of a church planter and even the purpose of the church, what the church is meant to be. And we just appreciate you taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Hope this has been a blessing.
That was Nathan Knight on church planting according to the Bible. For more, be sure to check out his book with Crossway, Planting by Pastoring, a vision for starting a healthy church. Pick up a print copy of the book for 30% off, or get the ebook or audiobook for 50% off directly from Crossway by visiting crossway.org/plus. If you like this interview, check out another conversation I had with Ray Ortlund and Sam Allberry entitled, When Churches Get Doctrine Right and Everything Else Wrong. To listen, click the link in the show notes or search for the episode in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. For more audio content like this, subscribe to the Crossway Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it with a friend and leaving us a review. Crossway is a not-for-profit Christian ministry that exists solely for the purpose of proclaiming the truth of God's Word through publishing gospel-centered content. Visit us today at crossway.org.